A raging pandemic, a dearth of life-saving equipment, and 90 days to manufacture a world-class ventilator. That is what the book, The Ventilator Project, is all about. We have the book's author, Amitabha Bandhopadhyay, who is also an associate professor at IIT Kanpur. He has conducted his doctoral research in the laboratory of Professor Uma Das Moitro at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York. Upon receiving his PhD in 2002, he joined the laboratory of Professor Clifford Tabin at Harvard Medical School for his postdoctoral research. We also have Srikant Sastri, who has co-authored the book The Ventilator Project. Shastri works with CEOs and owners of fast-growing organizations to help them navigate through the challenges and opportunities in an uncertain world. As a mentor and advisor, he guides them in incubating new ideas, initiatives, and ventures that bring in growth. Chief Reporter Daniel Thimaya will be chairing the session.
So let me dive straight in. Going back about a year in time, roughly, March 16th, when the Prime Minister, of course, just before the entire country went on lockdown, the Prime Minister came out and there was a call for innovation, to fight COVID and to come up with innovations because essentially borders were closed. Life as we know it was not ever going to be the same again. How did that inspire you, Professor Bandhopadhyay, to send out that message and call for, innovations? Of course, incubators. In China, of course, there was a big need for incubators because they were talking about it as one of the frontline defense mechanisms to cope with people with COVID who were intensive. How did this call go out? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so, I'm pretty sure that every Indian in those days, they were all thinking, how can we help the country? Okay, so me, IIT Kanpur, our incubated companies were no different. So when a message from none other than the Prime Minister came, we all thought that what is the best way to go about it. And I sent out the message as an SOS to the entire incubated company group. We have a WhatsApp group. Sent it out to them and many people responded. Some made the low-hanging fruits like PPE kits. The mask, the mask is being worn by the Prime Minister himself and our Defense Minister and many. It's called Swasa N95 mask. And then came these two young boys there, 2018 graduates. And they have been making these solar panel cleaning robots. They said that we would like to make ventilator. And, in those days, in the hindsight, ventilator was not really a key player for COVID treatment. But in those days, everybody thought that ventilator is a must-have. If you just look at the newspaper headlines in those days. So, we jumped right ahead.
So, Srikant, you're somebody who evaluates projects very fast. Given the number of startup pitches that you probably hear, you're probably more inundated than half the guys in Silicon Valley at the moment. But when you first heard of what Noka was doing, and I'm sure Professor Amitabha brought you this proposal for these guys, very young, very, very driven, saying that, we can bring up, put together a ventilator with pretty much very little expertise. What was the first thought that hit you?
Well, I think all of us were wanting to get involved and make a contribution at that point of time. So when Amitabha called me, he said, look, these guys, I knew these two guys from before because I'd spent time at the incubator. So I knew they were smart guys, no questions on that count. But he said, will you talk to them? I said, of course. So I told them, look, I believe you built something cool. Can you tell me more? So they sent me a WhatsApp image of a short video they'd created of their initial version. Very, very rough version. There was something working there using artificial lung, a balloon kind of a thing. The lung was being inflated. I said, tell me more. Then they sent me a detailed engineering drawing. Now, I've been out of engineering now for 35 years, so I had to kind of really grit myself to look at the drawing and understand it, but I did. And then Amitabha and I chatted and we brought in Saurabh Srivastava, who's also a well-known person in startup ecosystem. He's also on the board with us. So we said, look, there is something to this. These guys have thought it through. Let's support them. So basically, it was a quick decision within a matter of 48 hours, literally. It helped that we knew these two guys and knew they were innately talented. But we said, now let's help because they are a best candidate at this point of time.
Professor Bandhopadhyay, it's interesting because once this task force was put together, you had all of these, you had this very varied mix of very, very seasoned, experienced people who had a wealth of experience in various fields, and you had these very young guys who were extremely, tuned in. They were very they would jam with pretty much anything you give them. It's a very varied mix, and in fact, you talk about it in one of the chapters much later on about the kind of friction that is caused by old and young. But the question that I wanted to ask you was, one very interesting aspect is this 90-day target that you guys got together, to turn around something in 90 days, which is a drop in the ocean when it comes to most research projects or even academics. Why 90 days and how did it come about?
The objective was clear that we were studying as you will see in the book also, we were studying the relative graphs of COVID cases around the world. When we started, we had less than 100 cases, but we knew that we are going to hit a very, very high number. And again, we have to remember in those days, we did not know that ventilator will not be the ultimate solution. And we were under the impression that it will be. And we did not know either, and thankfully for the country, that after September, the number will start to go down. If we compared with the graphs of Europe or US, we were expecting a peak around July, August, and that will be a number, massively high. Therefore, if we had to serve a purpose, then we had no option but to finish it in, as fast as possible. Our original target was to accomplish it within 70 days, but 90 days was a little stretch because some of the regulatory aspects, so we were not very clear, that caused little delay. Yeah.
So Srikant, when the initial story started hitting the media, and people started labeling it the 50K ventilator, that must have given you a huge heart attack on one side and a little bit of joy on the other side because people were noticing it. Of course, eventually you did realize that the cost of the components and everything pegged the cost at it almost 6-7 times higher. What were your thoughts when people started calling it the 50K ventilator?
So initially, actually, all of us were excited about bringing forth a ventilator, which is sub 1 lakh rupees, and 50,000 was not too far from it. We actually stayed with that target for a little bit. What changed was the government regulatory framework kept shifting like goalposts, and every time they made a change, it added cost.
The
That's why it
EPS kept
started
changing at least a couple of times.
Yeah. Correct. And that's what made the change. Otherwise, we believed, because as Amitabha said, we expected a massive rise in the number of cases. So our goal was to make a ventilator available to even the smallest hospital in a tier 4 town in India, and therefore make it affordable, because we knew that imported ventilators are 8 lakhs to 20 lakhs and not available in sufficient numbers. And therefore we said, look, we have to make it accessible. So we stayed with that 50K number for a while. We were actually happy with the media coverage that talked about 50K. But the other thing that happened, other than the regulatory goalpost shifting, every Tom, Dick and Harry picked up a basic design and said, I've got a ventilator. And then that's when the government said, look, we must lay down some framework because we can't have quote unquote quacks out in the market with ventilators. And therefore the government put forth a regulatory framework. I just wish there was a lot more clarity on that front at one point of time, actually.
So I have to ask both of you, I mean, was it frustrating when you came up with a 110, and then just when the 110 was done, a few days before it had happened, the goalpost had gone further, and then you worked on the 210. And then even that sort of got pushed back because, the requirements kept getting better. What kind of impact did it have on the youngsters? I mean, were they frustrated? Remember, this is a time when they were stuck at home for about the better part of, say, 4 months, and it's not always easy to not have contact for that long. Yeah. What kind of impact did it have on these guys?
Okay, so it is very interesting, The youngsters are the ones, see, it was their life and career that was on the line, but it was them who kept us afloat. Like they took all of these challenges in their stride. it was us, the oldies, who were getting more frustrated, angry. Okay, why can't the government say the first thing in the right thing in the first place? But they said, no problem, sir. 3 days. So they had a target of giving us product update every 3 days, and they never failed on doing that. So there was one particular change where it is our fault that we did not understand the government's demand properly, that there has to be a real time of oxygen and air, and that will have to be independent of the rest of the function of the ventilator. So we did not have that, and our first trial, as we have mentioned in the book, did not go in our favor. There were many other issues, but this was the main thing. You would not believe, they flew back from Delhi to Pune, landed, got a taxi, went to Mumbai to our only manufacturing partner. He said that I have something like a mixer, brought it, came to their factory. Next day morning, they said, so now we have a solution. So, it was fantastic. The frustration was only on the oldies part. The youngsters were fantastic.
No, just so that the oldies are not made to look bad, let me present a one more perspective as well. So I think the youngsters took each of these as a technical challenge. Yes. And now a technical challenge is to a certain extent within their power to solve it. It requires brain power. It obviously requires parts and components, but it's still reasonably within their control. Whereas I think if you look at the division of work we had within the task force, we told the young Noka inventors, you focus on the invention and the design, leave everything else to us. So the oldies had to therefore go out and figure out, how do I now fly in components from Taiwan or Singapore? How do you now figure out what the government is thinking? How much more money do we now need to raise because something has changed? So I guess because the two groups were, it's not two groups, different people were handling different things, and the youngsters were in some ways insulated from a lot of these things. And so therefore that is one part of the story. The other part is that when we were meeting 12 noon every day, the first 10 minutes were spent in celebrating good news, or if there was a bottleneck like this, to perk each other up. And therefore those were literally catharsis sessions for everyone. And therefore, you then get back to work when everyone says, wow, okay, now we know we have a problem to solve. Let's solve it. Let's solve it within 24 hours. So I think combination of these factors, the division of work and the fact that everyone was talking to each other and trying to help everyone else.
Once the Nokark actually sort of found its stride, and after that one demo in Delhi, of course, that didn't go so well because of the lack of the cylinder. It goes without saying that, the path towards actual production and then getting it out on the market and getting it out to hospitals, many would actually consider that the most difficult part in any startup's ecosystem, right? In any startup's life cycle, simply because most of these things are taken for granted with a large pharma major, but with every startup, it is as bootstrapped as it gets, because you don't have the funds, you don't have the people, and you don't even have to think about how bad it can get in a pandemic, right? When you don't have guys who can come to office and you can push them out. And yet, simply because of the kind of people that you roped in and the kind of contacts they had and the kind of reach they had, you guys managed to pull it off, and you managed to pull it off stunningly, right? What were the most amazing, sort of stories from this fairy tale for both of you? Srikant, maybe you can tell me something that truly restored your hope, that, there's a hope for a great future for this country, for this company, for everything.
Yeah. So I'll talk about two stories. One is the role of the much maligned government, and that is one source of hope. The other is the story of collaboration cutting across hierarchies. Both of them are heartwarming. Let's talk about the government first, because government deserves that credit. April 9th, we needed vital components to build the first product. This was still 110. And the components were stuck in Singapore. Singapore was already in lockdown. It was in the distributor's warehouse. No flights, no courier service, no freight service. Knocking at every door, not possible. Without that, we were dead. Finally, we knocked at the doors of the government via Cabinet Secretariat, Ministry of External Affairs, Invest India. Invest India stepped in, reached out to the Indian High Commission in Singapore and said, look, we need to bring this back. And can you do something? And they figured out that there was this empty Singapore Airlines flight coming into India to ferry back stranded Singaporeans in India. And therefore, they said, we'll put the consignment in this. Not only did they work out that full logistics, but banks were not operating at full capacity in India. We couldn't even remit money to the shipper. They said, don't worry, we will stand guarantee. Can you imagine Indian High Commission standing guarantee for that payment? Consignment came on SQ 406 on 9th of April, landed at Delhi, landed at Bombay, it went to Pune. Government stepping up to do things like this on a crisis mode was fantastic, restores hope that there are many good people in the government. Hopefully it will get institutionalized so that everyone can feel the positive impact. The other one is collaboration between old and young. The youngest in the task force is 23, the oldest is 74. The two oldest people at 69 and 74 are Padma Bhushan and Padma Shri respectively. The 23-year-old is a just recent pass out of IIT Kanpur. And the debates in the Zoom call are those of equals. No hierarchies. People are not pulling rank. When the 23-year-old speaks, everyone knows that he's an expert on his topic. Technically, people listen to him. Even if the 69-year-old feels strongly about something and pushes him hard, the 23-year-old pushes back. To me, the breaking down of these hierarchies is so fantastic because it's a relationship of equals, and that kind of collaboration cutting across age groups, areas of expertise. If we build organizations and institutions based on such principles with no hierarchy, and even the older person learning from the younger person, I think that's a great way to move forward. Those to me are the two. There are many, many more anecdotes, but these are very heartwarming ones, memorable ones actually.
Professor, what about you? What was?
So I'll tell you.
Story that really touched you.
I cut short in my description of the first 4 days. That was before the task force was formed. So you understand that these are good engineers. I had no clue that they can actually make ventilators, right? So what I did is I gathered a team of doctors and IIT Kanpur professors to do the brainstorming. That is it at all possible? So the doctors explained what has to be done, and they told them in no uncertain term that, look, either you make an ICU ventilator or don't bother at all. Please do not make an ambu bag. And you know, so many agencies were trying to make ambu bag ventilators. They were little scared because they thought that ICU ventilator will be an invasive process, will they be able to do it, etc. But they got the engineering ideas. And imagine that the stores, everything was closed in those days, right? So they had access to a hobby store in Pune. And look at their logic. They said that, look, we have to do pressure sensing. Now, UAV, the commercially available UAVs, they will have a pressure sensor to measure altitude. So maybe I can use that pressure sensor. We need a pump. Aquariums have air pump. So maybe we can use an air pump from there. So that's how they gathered components. And in 4 days' time, they could give a demonstration of a prototype that Srikant also talked about to Professor Govindarajan. And Govindarajan said, Amitabh, you have a fantastic team. Just go ahead with them. They are capable. So that was like, you know, as a teacher of IIT Kanpur, as a keeper of this technology-based incubator system, it immediately restored faith that we have such fantastic engineers. Nikhil and Harshit are only two examples. I'm sure you have some 1,000 such Nikhils and Harshits. If they are given the right grooming, you will have hundreds of Mukhats being born in a year. So that is number one. And number two is that, as we are doing right now, we are conversing over Zoom, and it is pretty close to having a personal meeting. So suddenly you realize that you do not any longer need to be in the metro cities to achieve something. You can get your mentorship, you can get your connections, you can get everything sitting in a tier 2, tier 3 cities, perhaps even villages. Thanks to the efforts of the successive governments, we have very good internet penetration. Therefore, this is the time when you can create an ecosystem, not only in Bangalore, Pune, Noida, but pan-India. So that is another, very hopeful prospect.
Fantastic. I mean, to think about life without internet, pandemic or otherwise, I think would be very, very difficult for most of us to really think about it. Srikant, I must ask you, towards the end of the book, one of the things that were sort of very succinctly ruled as a missed opportunity was why, a company like Nokia, which have brought out this fabulous product, and a few others who brought out cutting edge innovations in line with what the PM had asked for and what the country needed, was that all of the procurement was centrally done, and these contracts very often tend to only go to a certain company, which
Yeah.
a certain set of companies which have a certain set of requirements that they fulfill, and how if we were to perhaps bridge these red tape laden bureaucratic guidelines, smaller companies would really truly move towards an Atmanirbhar Bharat and really
Yeah.
revitalize the whole Make in India,
Yeah.
Startup India ecosystem. What are your thoughts on some of the things that could potentially change, especially after this pandemic?
Sure. So, one, it's very clear that for any sector to grow in India, one of two gods has to smile. God number one is government as a big benefactor and buyer. God number two is a big private sector player. To me, Maruti Udyog is a great example. With 50% market share, it has become the god for every auto component manufacturer in India, which is why auto component industry in India is booming. So medical devices, we don't have the second kind of god. So therefore, it comes back to the first kind of god, particularly because the government is the biggest buyer, given that government health infrastructure across the country runs so many hospitals. So unless the government starts buying, you'll never have an Indian medical device industry really growing. Fortunately, I think there are two or three things that are happening now slowly. One is that the government e-procurement system, which even though that came up in 2016, I think, was not really helping startups. So now they've got something called
gaining some momentum.
Finally gaining some momentum. They have something called as a startup runway as a sub scheme there. So that it doesn't have requirements like you must have a 3-year track record or show me which hospital you deployed in. So they've kind of waived off some of those. But having said that, I must still say that most startups have still not felt the impact of that because the startup runway has taken time to take off. Not every bureaucrat understands it. So this is one part. Government as a buyer, willing to take risks and not playing safe by saying, let's buy a multinational product because it's been around for ages. The second would be to create an ecosystem where testing, certification of products and a regulatory framework is totally cleaned up so that you're not kind of shooting in the dark. And that is an area where work is still to happen and we haven't seen much happening. And finally, there is a whole manufacturing ecosystem, which as it happens, in the 2020 budget, not just this one, they laid out specific aims and they set out budget allocations for creating what are called as technology clusters where hardware can be manufactured, done prototyped and manufactured. So bits and pieces, the work is happening. But I think with this year, with the pandemic, healthcare, as we saw in this year's budget, has got a higher budget. I think at least medical devices, healthcare related products, things will move faster. Can it move faster than this? Yes, absolutely. But I think the intentions are there.
Great. I'm going to wrap this up with just a question or two about the book. The ventilator project, just like the actual ventilator project, has sort of, the book itself has happened at jet speed. And, no part of it is fiction. And yet it's such a sort of thrilling journey that, it makes you feel very good at the end of it. That, guys who probably lived next door to you and you never knew really what they did when they went to work, managed to achieve something, that most multinational companies were grappling. And that to me is a fabulous takeaway from the book. But do tell me, how did you guys manage to get this book out as fast as you did? I know that you did the ventilator in 90 days. How long did it take to do the book?
So the book took, I would say the actual writing took under 90 days because towards the later part of the task force, two things happened actually. One is that a couple of stray comments. One is one of the senior people in US, Yashdeep Kumar, he said, this model, multinationals need to learn from it. A medical device normally takes 18 to 24 months. The fact that you guys have done it in 90 days without cutting corners is going to be the new paradigm. That is one statement he made. And the second statement was, 90 days, our spouses barely saw us. and therefore we would go up for meals periodically. And obviously we would tell them what's been happening. So one day my wife made a passing remark saying, look, there's so much learning here. Why don't you guys work on a book? So I bounced that idea of Amitabha. He said, yes, let's do it. And fortunately, we get along very well. We're great friends and we have complementary skills. So we said, let's go ahead and do it. After that, I think we wrote a concept note, ran it past a publisher. To the publisher's credit, they liked it quickly. After that, the writing was essentially, uh, fortunately, I think both of us believe in structured thinking. So the organizing of the thought process in terms of who are the people we need to talk to, how to document facts. A lot of the facts are available in our WhatsApp groups of the Ventilator project and the email trails of the Ventilator project. And we had to plug the gaps by going back and talking to all the 20 members of the task force and people outside. We had to go back and talk to people in the government and others to say, look, let's check these facts one by one and also fill in some of the anecdotes that they saw it from the outside. So I think it was express speed. Amitabha may want to add it as well.
Well, I would say that this was perhaps a tad bit more difficult for me than being in the Ventilator project, because by that time the classes started. Okay. And I have serious teaching load. Students started to come back to the lab, so I have to pay attention to them as well. But Srikant is very, very structured. Okay, so I would basically just plug in and plug out only for the time that I will be actually typing. And Srikant would have the entire material ready, that what I need to write and why. So it was not very difficult for me. So I basically spent exactly the number of hours that I typed. And then, we arranged for a friend to do the first read of the book and do some edits. So all of these, fantastic planning by Srikant actually cut down the time.
And there was also one other source of inspiration, the Himalayas. So I spent 2 months in Uttarakhand looking at the mountains and writing. Every morning from 6 a.m. to 11 a.m. was my book writing period. So that's how I carved out my time, and rest of the day was business as usual, normal work, actually.
I can think of a few better ways to actually sit down and put a book together, honestly. And what I particularly like is each of the chapters ends with a little bit of reflection, and there's a solid point by point takeaway for everybody who wants to have a startup, who wants to start up, who wants to make their startup go bigger. And I think it's a fantastic idea. I think everybody who's got startup dreams must read the Ventilator project. Srikant, of course, had recently tweeted saying the biggest takeaway from the book for him is hope. And honestly, today, as we as we're in the throes of this battle with the pandemic and COVID vaccines going all over the place, hope is all we have. And we have a dream that an Indian product can truly revolutionize the way that we look at life and the way we live life. Thank you very much, gentlemen. It's been a pleasurable conversation.
Thank you.
I truly look forward to more from you guys, and I hope that Indian products really get the respect that they deserve, both in the market and in our homes and lives. Thank you very much, Srikant.
Thanks, Danny.
Thank you, Danny. Pleasure talking to you. Look forward to seeing you in Chennai sometime.
Yes.
Absolutely. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed that session. If you want to catch the other sessions of the ThinkEDU Conclave 2021, you can log on to eventexpress.com, newindianexpress.com, or even edxlive.com. If you are more of a social media person, you can also join us on our Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube handles.